Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Technicom video, we're going to be further discussing the PlayStation 4 and its architecture, and this is from new information from the guys behind Resogun. Now, the developers behind Resogun, also known as HouseMaque, are very confident in the PlayStation 4's architecture, and they've actually called certain functions and features of the PS4, and I quote, necessary for their development of their certain title. And in this short interview, it's not particularly long, but it does give you an idea of just how powerful the compute shaders are of the PS4. Their title is actually running at 1080p at 60 frames per second, which for most people is known as the butter zone. You know, you get the 60 frames per second, it's like the Goldilocks zone, which is like the perfect combination of all elements. Now, their engine is actually using voxels, and each of those, pretty much all of the cubes in the levels are destructible. However, obviously there are a few that can't be destroyed for the purposes of, well, you know, some gameplay elements, of course. You can't completely destroy and obliterate everything, because then it would just be a complete mess. However, each of those voxels, the engine can support up to about 500,000, they're saying, but generally they like to keep it about the 200,000 range, but each of those could be shadowed with its own light sourcing and much more besides. So, they were asked, what do they think of the unified architecture and 8GB of GDDR5 memory, and what do they think of this on the PS4? Remember, this is a PS4 exclusive. Harry Kruger from the team replied, and I quote, "It's not just helping, it is necessary. With the unified architecture, we can easily split up our memory usage the way we want and still have fast GPU access to the bits written by the CPU. We are using more memory on the PS3 has in total just for flying cubes. The GPU and compute shaders are being heavily utilized for a lot of things. For example, all of the geometry generation for the cubes in the level, the physics, the collisions for the cubes, the particle mayhem you unleash via overdrive and bombs, all of that is being done on compute shaders. There is still plenty of CPU power left over. Currently, we're cruising around 50% CPU usage during gameplay, but with the GPU and compute shaders doing all the fireworks, we don't really even need to use it." Now, that statement is fairly short, but obviously this is out of quote. But despite that statement being relatively short, this puts into perspective a lot of the stuff that we've been discussing for a long time on this channel. This demonstrates the use of the PlayStation 4's unified memory. In fact, it's the heterogeneous unified memory architecture. Basically, the CPU, of course, can farm out work to the GPU. The GPU can write that, and of course, it has various functions that Sony have improved on. For example, the volatile bit, which of course can nuke certain lines in the cache. They've got much better queue systems for the compute. They've bolstered much more powerful compute systems in the standard GCN architecture, and the whole purpose behind this is simply to be able to run stuff like this. Now, the CPU inside the PlayStation 4 isn't bad. I mean, it's not a shabby processor by any means. We know that, of course, it does actually have 6 cores currently. That's the key word. I mean, maybe Sony will change this in the future, but 6 cores are available to developers, and they're only hovering at about 50% CPU usage. So if you want to take it literally, you could say that 3 of the cores are basically being maxed out, and 3 could basically be just making coffee and chilling in the background. That's actually really good news, because people have been somewhat concerned, actually, that the AMD Jaguar could be the weak link of the system. There has been some comments that, okay, you've got really beefy GPU in there, but how's it going to work? Now, Mark Cerny and the PlayStation 4 team, to be fair, have stated numerous times that don't worry, the GPU is going to be able to handle a lot of this. Now, for those of you who are not too familiar with the architecture, I'm going to give you a very brief rundown. The GPU can actually process this stuff. You can tell I've just woken up. Process this stuff while the graphics are not really taking so much of a toll. So in other words, it will execute this in cycles where it basically can fit in the compute cycle. That's why it's actually really good that they've improved the queue structure. Because of this, in theory, it should not really have a negative impact in the frame, and one of the other purposes behind the volatile bit, of course, as regular viewers will know, is the fact that it will actually enable them to utilize much more efficiently the level 2 cache. Now, level 2 cache, of course, is not just for the CPU, it's also for the GPU. It has its own independent one. And with the level 2 cache, generally speaking, you don't want to, well, obviously generally speaking, but you don't want to just simply nuke all the stuff that's in the cache, because that means you're going to have more separate read and write operations, which not only waste bandwidth, but you're also wasting compute cycles while you're waiting for that cache to fill up. So Sony are basically using the volatile bit to nuke any relevant parts in the cache for compute. So let's say, for example, obviously it's completely made up, but let's say you have 100 lines of graphic, let's say you have 100 lines in the cache. Obviously it's going to be far more than that, but let's just make it simple. And let's say that lines 1 to 90 are graphics, and 91 to 100 are compute. Okay, I think that makes some sense. Well, let's assume that all you need to do is nuke lines 95 to 100. Lines 91 to 94 are still good with compute. They still need that information. And of course, you still need the graphics information. That's not changed, right, for that scene. So you still need that. Well, what happens? Do you, what makes more sense? Do you, delete everything, so basically shift delete, and send it, to the great oblivion, or would it make more sense to just say, okay, well, we're just going to nuke those, those last few lines? Of course, the second option makes more sense, and volatile bit makes that much easier, and they're able to actually trace which lines have done what, so that's what the purpose is behind that. Now, he was also asked how much more powerful the PlayStation 3 is in regards to the PS4, and Kruger has replied, "We have worked on many platforms in the past. On development side, the two are not at all different. I'm sorry, let me begin again with some English. On the development side, the two are not all that different, only instead of hard-to-program SPUs that require assembly-level programming, if you want to extract the full potential, now have compute shaders that are easy to program for, and most of the cumbersome scaffolding is now done on GPU hardware. One of the differences is that when things go wrong, PS3 GPU crashes, but the PS4 GPU hangs. Note, you just read some code humor. As for power, anyone who can also look at these figures on paper is powerful enough to blow your pants off. Now, we're going to quickly analyze this. We're not going to go super in depth, but this is one of the problems with the PlayStation 3's architecture. I've been discussing this a little bit with a recent video I've done. I'm going to actually do the second part today, which is regarding the move to the x86 architecture as well as APU. As we discussed, the PlayStation 3 Cell previously was an in-order processor, and to kind of compound that problem, it was also a RISC processor. Now, RISC, of course, means a reduced instruction set rather than complex instruction set computing. And that might not sound a big deal to you and I, but for developers it means that if there's an instruction you specifically need to make, for example, memory read and write changes, it could be a bit of a pain in the ass, actually, because you have to actually code that, sometimes in machine-level language, which is not exactly ideal. That's not to say that the cell processor sucked. The SPUs on it were actually vector-based, so you could actually use them. And by the way, they're also SIMD as well, so that's single instruction multi-data. That's very similar to the architecture on the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 4's GPU. But things are starting to progress a little bit now. It's certainly a lot easier because you've got much better levels of API control. I think, if I had to guess as well, I would say that the tool chains for the PlayStation 4 are much more mature compared to what they were on the PS3. The PS3 tool chains, especially in the beginning, were pretty sucky. They were very basic. They weren't really up to snuff. And Sony recognized that, to be fair, and they recognized that you can't just leave the developers to do everything and just let them flounder in the water. The in-order part of the processor, of course, of the PlayStation 3, also a little bit of a problem, because that means, of course, that instructions are expected to be sent to the CPU. The CPU is expected to receive those instructions in a specific order, in a specific manner, and in a specific fashion. And that really comes down a lot to the compiler. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is still written in C or C++ with its various libraries, but it's certainly become a hell of a lot easier. You could see that a lot of the compute stuff, for example, is written in C++, and you can actually do some Googling yourself. I'm going to be doing some stuff on this anyway regarding the PlayStation shader language. I've actually got a video of that up already. I'm going to be doing a second video this weekend, so you can check that out. Really good stuff on that, by the way. I'm also going to be doing an article as well, because I really want to do that. I'm just a little bit behind, unfortunately, because I'm working some stuff in the background for the channel, which I can't reveal yet. But regardless, anyway, the PlayStation shader language does allow a lot of this stuff as well, and obviously the shader language does include things such as various lighting operations, textures, and whatever else. So it's definitely a very powerful language indeed. Now, here's one that I'm sure is going to pretty much light a fire under a lot of arguments right now, but it was also asked from a developer's perspective, do you see developers using the extra GDDR5 RAM and more GPU compute to churn out better exclusives and multi-platform games on the PlayStation 4? Harry replied, and I quote, "Definitely. In this generation, the PS4 seems to be the console with the fewest quirks. No embedded DRAM, just raw power. Sony's signature low-level graphics API may leave some developers with bloody knuckles, but also gives access to a lot more potential. This time, PCs and consoles are a lot more common than before, making multi-platform easier, but this time, people ramp up the effects on the PS4. And furthermore, they were also asked what do they think about the porting times, because, for example, Warframe, their developers, or creators, shall I say, Digital Extreme, said it only took about 3 months to get their title up and running on the PS4. And there's also, this is out of quote, but there's also some other stuff regarding, for example, the Call of Duty developers. One argument is that, well, one rumour, and once again, I don't know how much stock I put in these rumours, but there you have it. One rumour is that they got Call of Duty Ghosts working on the PlayStation 4 hardware, the development kits, in about 3 to 4 weeks, and they were getting about 90 frames per second at 1080p. This is contrary to the Xbox One. The rumour says that they were getting, I think it was 15 frames per second in about 3 to 4 months. And once again, you can Google that. This has apparently been said in E3, and a developer was actually stating this on the board, but on a couple of message boards. But the thing is, it wasn't him saying it. He was working on a different game. I honestly can't remember what the developer was now, but you could Google this quote anyway. It's, readily available on the internet. And apparently that was the rumour going about when all the developers were talking and, on the shop floor, that was the difference in the power. And of course, other developers have said that there's about 50% discrepancy between the PS4 and X1. Regardless, I'm going to continue. Harry said it took a little bit longer. I don't know how many people are working on Warframe the PS4, but we had 2 long-time veterans and 1 relatively new hire. A few others helped too, but the graphics engine takes the lion's share of the effort. Now, I'm going to end the quote for a moment, and let's talk about this just for a moment. This is a great example of what a small development team can actually achieve now. One of the problems with the previous generation, the power architecture, remember that the PS3 and Xbox 360, the PS3's CPU was basically using a PPE, which is a power processing element engine, and then you've got the SPEs, which are synergistic processing elements, and that was basically the creation of the cell. So that the PPEs tell the SPEs what to do, right? Simple as that. But in regards to, sometimes, by the way, they're known as synergistic processing units rather than synergistic processing elements, just to why some people call it SPUs and other people call it SPEs. I'm just clarifying that for you guys. But the Xbox 360's CPU was actually 3 PPEs. Now, the PPE runs at 3.2 gigahertz, which is one of the reasons that both CPUs of both consoles run at that clock speed. And the Xbox 360 ended up with a tri-core processor capable of 6 threads, and that's completely contrary to the PS3. 2 main hardware threads, and then all of the SPEs, of course. Now, the SPEs were actually ridiculously powerful, and they could do a lot of stuff, but it was kind of a nightmare to program for. And smaller teams actually generally generally found the 360 a little bit easier. Because the SPEs, as it turns out, you needed to be quite familiar, as he said, with assembly level language. It's not that it was impossible. Smaller teams were starting to get the hang of it, especially as better chains came out, better software libraries, I imagine, as well, which basically all they do would be, there would be almost like a selection of different commands. This is very similar to, I want to do a lot more on programming. I just haven't had the time really to show you guys, but I will be doing it in the next couple of weeks or so. But this is very similar to like C++ libraries or C libraries, where you could have like, for example, IOStream, which is basically a library that's already inbuilt, and it will reference that library, and that allows user interaction. For example, you can type and enter a figure into the program. For example, you could type in 1 + 1 or something like that, and it would, of course, allow the calculation. It would also see out, which would basically display that calculation on screen. Now, this is really important because you could technically enter a lot of this stuff yourself. You could program all of that stuff yourself, but there are predefined libraries which you can basically call, and then when it's assembled, the used parts of those libraries will be assembled into the final binary. This is very, very easy stuff in terms of programming, because you don't need to do the work. In other words, the library is already predefined, so why the hell should you bother to write anything to do any of those functions for you? Now, of course, once again, you can customize it if you so wish, but most people, for basic tasks, you don't have to do that. Maybe if you want to reduce the size of your binary, or you want to do some specific things, you'd maybe calculate that anyway, but whatever. But for the purposes of this, the PS4's a GPU in it, and CPU are a lot easier to use, and this is one of the reasons that, if I had to guess, we're going to be getting a lot more developers on the PlayStation 4. I mean, as this guy said, look, 2 long-time veterans and 1 relatively new hire. So you could say that's 3, and a few others helped too. But if you say helped, then let's say that's 2 people who are basically doing probably the work of 1 full-time guy. If I had to guess, they're probably either having a couple of people on part-time, or they're basically saying, well, if you help out, I don't know what their financial arrangements are, I'm not going to, condemn them or whatever, but let's assume that it's effectively 4 people working on the title, right? Because let's say a few of us helping is the equivalent of 1 full-time person, so you can effectively say 4 people basically created this game, and I think that's pretty damn impressive. Considering it's really new hardware, they've basically got this title running on 60 frames per second at 1080p. Sure, people were going to immediately tell me, this is not Uncharted, this is not The Last of Us 2, this is not something like, Battlefield 4, or, something ridiculously complex. But can you really expect that from a small indie development team, for A? For B, remember, this is first generation stuff, and launch stuff as well, might I add. And for C, it goes to show you just how imperative, I would use the word imperative, good, easy-to-use software is, and this has been something that I've been saying for a long time, so I'm really happy that developers have been so kind as to give this kind of information away, because it's starting to really unlock what I consider to be the gems of the next generation of consoles. It's not necessarily that they've got tons of extra power, which of course they do. You could do the G-flop calculations yourself. I'm not going to go into it too much, just, it's not very difficult to work out the raw numbers, and even the raw numbers don't necessarily indicate or give a finite example of how much extra performance is going to be, but this is a great indication that the next generation is going to be considerably easier to develop for, which in my opinion is going to mean that we're going to get cheaper development time, quicker turnaround of titles, which is always a good thing, not just for you and I as consumers, because obviously we don't want to wait 12 months for a title if we can wait 9 months for a title, and also of course for developers as well, because of course very costly, expensive projects are very dangerous. And we've also heard, for example, about AAA titles, and one of the problems with AAA or even any game development is it's quite expensive, so if you could do anything to reduce the cost, hey, more power to you. Anyway, this has been a bit of an itsy bitsy all over the shop video, as To be honest with you, mine tend to be, but hopefully you've found it somewhat informative and you've enjoyed it. Nevertheless, I will see you guys soon. As per normal, if you want to contact me directly, that's facebook.com/redgamingtech. I am out of here. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.